So Serge, in this episode I wanted to talk about the true meaning of transparency. In about 2010 you predicted that people in public life there would be more kind of open scandal than ever before. Like, people just wouldn't be able to hide their indiscretions. It'd be very public. And of course, in the last few years, we've just seen outrage after outrage to the point where it's like it doesn't even touch the sides for people anymore. Like, you know, back in the day, years ago, if a politician had an affair or if something happened or if there was some kind of scandal, it would be like there was some kind of moral standard that you couldn't breach in public life, and then suddenly your career would be over and stuff like that. Now it just seems that it's more open book than ever, the amount of indiscretions. Yes, there's fallout, people lose jobs and stuff like that, but people are almost getting fatigued as to how much more that we can see of the outrage in public life. And so there's kind of like, it feels like the world has changed in some capacity in terms of an up to level of the inability to hide the rot. That there's like a greater transparency as to how people are actually living their lives. And what in tandem this is also exposing is the fact that this isn't actually rocking people's boats. It's not changing people's minds. People are still going on, you know, with voting in who they're going to vote in, or following whatever celebrity regardless. So it's an exposure of the callousness of this spiritual intelligence that we've been talking about in the previous episodes as well. So I wanted to talk to you about transparency in regards to the pranic-based intelligence and form of transparency that we see that can't even hide itself anymore. But also, what does transparency look like from a soul-based perspective? And the other question I wanted to ask is, why is there seemingly more, you know, the behind closed doors is now much more out in the open in life? What's energetically shifted? And you've spoken about the age of Aquarius and what that actually means. And I wanted to talk about the relationship between the age of Aquarius and transparency.
Thank you, Rebecca. Not only did I predict about the characters themselves being more transparent than ever before, but also industry. Industry, business, models, the whole system of human life is going to be exposed. I subsequently added to that prediction not long thereafter in shorter discussions, and then eventually on a bigger presentation. And that is that over the next 50 to 100 years, there will be no doubt whatsoever, due to the levels of transparency, that there is an unhuman intelligence running the human race. And that adds to the episodes that we've been talking about, because it will be very, very apparent that the intelligence that runs being human, is not human. And that's why it doesn't care. It doesn't care about the systems, it doesn't care. Now, I'm going to be attacked for that level of care. But you show me the eradication of disproportion. You show me the eradication of the violence, the belligerence, the vilification, the judgment, the defamation, and everything else that goes on in society. Show me a society that truly cooperates. You show me a society where bullying does not exist, I'll retire. Because that's simple. I don't have to open my mouth and say anything else anymore. Because we've got an intelligence as intelligent. I'm redundant by virtue of what I've been presenting all along. So don't pretend, don't attack me based on non-examination of your own intelligence. Don't attack me based on non-examination of your own model. And don't try and defame me based on your projection of what you say I am, and by extracting small amount of words and then making them out to be something that I haven't said. Represent me in the whole that I have presented. So this leads us to then, what is transparency? Transparency can only be a whole. It has to be a whole. The whole that you belong to has to be transparent. And that's what I've been saying all along. And when we talk about being in an era, we're talking about being in something that we are completely engulfed by. It's a constellation we have slipped into by virtue of the mechanics of our planet and the solar system. So we are inside something and we cannot escape it. And that's why it's very easy to predict what can and cannot be. If you are untoward, you get exposed. If you are aligned, you flow. It's very, very simple. There's nothing, out of this world about it. So what exactly is transparency? Transparency is the ability to show that you are in the flow of universality. That's what transparency is supposed to be about. And then transparency, when it's not truly lived, it shows itself out to be the irregular. So then what is irregular stands out a lot more. What you were talking about in your intro is actually the irregular is so regular that nobody is batting an eyelid, as we say, because simply it's just become so obvious. And that's what the next 50 to 100 years are going to be about. It's that our intelligence is so dedicated to being irregular that there will be no doubt whatsoever. What we have based our model of society on is an intelligence that doesn't give a cahoot about being human.
There's an absolute callousness towards the human being, in fact.
Correct.
It gets savaged by life this without seemingly any recourse. But this is huge that you've just landed, that there's an intelligence that is running the show that doesn't come from the human being, because why would the human being destroy, denigrate itself? So actually what we're seeing, by seeing the writing on the wall of all the debauchery that is now part and parcel of people in public life, and therefore is obviously just a microcosm of people everywhere, of what people are living like, this is actually a good thing, insofar as let's start to call the pictures as being BS. Like, let's start to say, no, like, not to name names, but JFK wasn't the perfect guy. He wasn't America's darling. He had lots of, personal problems, drug addictions, womanizing, etc. But, just to pluck anyone out of history, you can pretty much say it about anyone now. And you've got a situation where there's no perfect picture of life that we can subscribe to anymore. And that's part of the breaking down of the image of making life good. Would you agree?
I agree, but the problem is even worse, because if you find someone that is truly transparent and you find that they don't have any skeletons in the closet, it's very simple. Make them up.
Yeah, well, that's the only way that you can not reflect on the waywardness of everything else. You have to make the one thing that you feel is pure, you have to somehow make that appear wayward and to thwart that reflection.
So we have a case of the irregular being regularized.
Yeah.
So regulated, I should say, so that becomes a normal. But when you get what is regular, truly regular, you have to bring in the irregular. You have to make it up so that it looks like it's irregular, so that it fits into the irregular of the normality that we've tried to make regular. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's the Matrix basically trying to protect its own game.
But it's not really crazy. What it is, it's the transparency of the intelligence that we have subscribed to. It's the intelligence that is running the society, and it's the intelligence that forms the basis of this type of model that we call human life. And when we get rid of that intelligence, our problems will all go away. It's very simple. It is actually very, very simple, but there is an enormous tide of pride. There is an enormous tide of vested interests that have to protect their current positions, and therefore they will be upset that there is a greater form of transparency that they are also part of, but are not yet willing to let go yet.
Okay, so let's talk about, you've got at different stages of your life or at different stages of people's evolution, they're going to come to a point where they say, this isn't it. But then there's people that are at other stages that are going to hold on for dear life to the model that isn't working. So there's a relationship between the people that are saying, no, we have to have a certain amount of vulnerability and say this isn't working, and those that are staunchly defending the current model. Of the people that are wanting to go to that vulnerability and wanting to question, what happens in terms of, there must be a mass of people that have a sense that there's something more, but aren't really going all the way, because it's the mass that determines the agreement of what the model sets as the standard, isn't it? So what's the ratio of people that are staunchly defending the model to the people that are actually privately saying, this isn't it? Do you have a sense of that ratio in humanity of what that is?
It's not so much an exact number, but it's definitely a sense. And so let's go to the most vocal minority. They're the ones that are making the noises and hurling the abuse and hurling the fake news and the lies and controlling basically the sentiment of what is generally acceptable as public knowledge or not. And then you've got a big proportion of the silent majority who are already sensing that things are not making sense, but they are so much into the plague of comfort and distraction and withdrawal. They care not about making any changes so long as their pocket of life is well looked after. And let's face it, poverty today is very different to how it used to be in not so long ago, because everybody has access to some form of roofings, a good bed, and the most important thing these days is television. So if they've got some form of distraction, be it drugs, screen time,
and we're talking more in the Western world here.
Well, we're talking about most of the world, really, because everybody's got some form of level of distraction. Otherwise, how could the human being just sit back and not do anything? And so if we are, say, 60% developed world, how can we turn a blind eye to what is disproportionately going on? We have to be able to turn our eye towards something that's distracting us. And so we're spending a lot of time on a screen, checking ourselves out, rather than seeing what else we could put our efforts and purpose towards. So that's always been there. There's nothing weird about it. And coming back to the word transparency, our very Bible tells us that Exodus was the plight of the slaves. And then not long ago, we had black slavery all over the world. They were transported from Africa to South America, to Americas, to England, and all areas. So we've known slavery. So we've had Exodus, and we've had the slavery we all know. And today, it's a growing industry. It's actually greater than the biblical proportion that makes Exodus so famous, and then greater than the Negro thing that we had as a problem in America and the northern parts of South America and in Spain and in England.
Negro enslavement.
Negro enslaving, enslavement. So, or the African enslaving, the trade itself. So, what's happened to us? The transparency has always been there, and what are we doing about it? So it's not so much that it's out now more, and it is, than ever before. The point is, the intelligence that's running the show doesn't care. It doesn't care if it's a bout of slavery. It doesn't care if it's a bout of pain-killing addiction, pain-reducing addiction.
Which is a huge problem.
I think it's called fentanyl or something like that. It doesn't care if it's an outbreak of ice, as we have in our local area, the methamphetamine stuff that's available. Cocaine has been around for a long time. Heroin, alcohol is still a problem. It doesn't matter how transparent it gets, because so long as that intelligence is protecting itself, there's not a problem.
Because as long as that intelligence is protecting itself, even the silent majority will sit back while it happens. You know, like you were talking about screens, it's like not unusual now for someone to have Netflix on while they're on their mobile phone. A friend of mine was just saying that she went to check out on Facebook and then she realised she was already on Facebook. So she needed a Facebook of the Facebook to check out further. And she was looking for a distraction even when she was in distraction. And so this is the state that we've gotten to, but why the eternal unrest? Like, nothing seems to satiate the person, so-called just looking for distraction after distraction. Nothing's enough. No amount of pain-killing medication, no amount of alcohol abuse actually satiates that the unrest that the human being feels. So what is actually being avoided?
It takes us back to the great question, and that you started off with, and the field that you wanted this interview to go into, and that is that we are in a period known as the Aquarian constellation. And it's not Aquarius New Age or anything like that. It's just a very simple constellation. And if we understand from the science of universal medicine, not my business, but the science of universal medicine as a science itself.
Medicine that's universal.
Correct. Yeah. We understand that we have to comprehend. We have to have the full comprehension of what each constellation means. And we are, no doubt, and no surprise, we are in a constellation where transparency, as a result of the heightened awareness, is at an all-time high. And it's also the movement of elevating the human body, not the human being, but the human body, into its greater levels of awareness. And also with that comes the expansion of consciousness. So for the next 2,600 years, we are up against it if we are going to go against the flow of the development of greater awareness. Now, no coincidence that since the beginning of 2012, and actually it changed in 30th of November 2011, but since 2012, screen time has gone to an all-time high. There's an insatiable plague to check out. Why? Because people cannot escape the increase in awareness.
So let's break this down a bit, because you've introduced something big, and that is that the body's particles are awakening more, that there's a greater awareness in the body. What relationship does the body have on our awareness of soul?
The body is made up of divine particles, and they cannot but obey the universal laws. They will adhere to universal medicine. They will move and align and respond without any form of restriction to the constellation of Aquarius. So our bodies are becoming more and more aware. And there is not enough food now to dull the body, and that's why we're getting the explosion of hybrid fooding, as I call it. Because they're just making up concoctions to try and get in, the damp and the raciness and the protection and everything else that we need, that dulling.
The choc salted caramel on top of the pizza.
Salted caramel, choc salted, salted caramel. All of that in order to give the body a little bit of a reprieve from the level of awareness. But what is that awareness? What are we hiding? What is it about? What is it that we're resisting? Awareness to be more loving, more truthful, more honest, more caring, more nurturing. We have increased our awareness to once and for all be universal. It's so simple, and that's what we're fighting.
Why are we fighting it? Why? If from a standpoint of logic, who wouldn't want to be more loving? Who wouldn't want to be more settled and deeply at ease in themselves? Why would we want to give ourselves the buzz of a racy, sugary drink to make ourselves feel more nervous energy when we could feel the settlement of the soul and the joy that's inherent in the soul?
Nobody who is aligned to the pranic consciousness would not say that they would want a much more loving life, a much easier life, a much more simple life. However, you have to be able to release the desires that come with that. So you can't have both. And so if you're not willing to release the desires, and you can only do that by aligning to the soul consciousness, you can't have both, the best of both worlds. So the constellation is saying, you can stay where you are because there's no judgment, but over here, this is what we're offering. Greater capacity for wisdom, love and intelligence. Easily, because it's pouring through us. That's what the constellation, pouring through every single human being on the planet, bar none. No privileges, no judgment. It is just beautiful how it's happening. But if you want to have all of that, you can't have all the desires that the other pranic consciousness is offering. In other words, you can't belong to the two spheres of intelligence at the one time. You can only be one or the other. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is.
Break down the word desire for me. What does desire mean in the sense that you're speaking about?
Desire is anything that brings you stimulation or withdrawal outside of your body. That's all desire is.
So
you have it all within you. So if you deny that and you seek for one split second something outside of you by way of stimulation, as in, I need that to do this, so it's a stepping point. Or if you need something outside of you to withdraw, then you have sought desire. That is, something that is outside of you is desire. That's what desire truly is.
Right, just something that's outside of you.
Correct.
So getting off on browsing news or Facebook or to check out, that's something outside of you that affects the human body, then becomes an imposition on the divine particles, and therefore you're in a state of unrest. Or it could be something outside of you that's not obviously outside of you, like running late for something so that you're sourcing nervous energy to get there. That's still calculating an effect that's going to affect your body, isn't it?
Yeah, but there's a desire created by the stimulation, because you put yourself in a situation where you run late to source that. So you have sought outside yourself a situation that stimulates to give you the stimulation.
Ah, yeah, of course. So the situation and the time-based moment, that's your outside point.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a desire to run late.
Yeah.
Because it's stimulating.
Yeah, yeah. So that, yeah, got it. So it's just anything that's outside of you. So when you actually settle and feel the all that is within you, then everything that you're familiar with in terms of what has maybe run your life until this point, the stimulation of getting recognition for doing well in school, or the different stimulations we get from outside of ourselves, from accolades, all of that now is rendered meaningless. Is that why we have such trouble saying, well, just let's align to soul, because it hasn't been made familiar to us?
I'll be the first to say that it's very difficult to understand when you're aligned to the pranic consciousness. It's very difficult to come out of that, because it's not you making the decision that you want to come out. It's a process of alignment. So you can probably think that you're ruminating the possibility, but the intelligence that it's feeding you that is the one allowing you to ruminate, knowing that you can't come out of it, because it's not possible for you to truly contemplate once you're aligned. So it's one of those things that we can apply the vicious circle jargon to it, because that's how it is. Look, if you are connected to your inner being, your innermost, let's call it, not just the inner being, but your innermost, there's no need for stimulation, and definitely there's no need for withdrawal, because your body is imbued with enormous amount of energy to be purposeful. And that purpose is never for you, it's for everybody equally. Therefore, what stimulation do you need when there is already enormous amount of joy, which is the production of greater space to be in? So that's all joy is, the production of greater space, or to be in space by your own movements. And so you can't want for any more than that. It's the greatest form of what we would call satisfaction. But it's greater than satisfaction. It's the settlement of being in space. And it can only come from your movements that produce equalness with other people. And look, it's all words, but there's a science to this. And I'm not trying to sound good, and I'm not selling anything. It's a very, very simple way of being. Simply, there is no stimulation or withdrawal, because you're in the movement of something that is working towards equalizing everything. No one is to be left behind.
Just to take it back to what you said just before about that when you're thinking from the pranic intelligence, you can't source the thoughts to get out of the pranic intelligence. It's like when you're inside that sphere of intelligence, the thought that you get fed about going to soul is that you're going to somehow lose your freedoms, lose your ability to play in creation, to do whatever you like to do, because the soul looks boring. Like the soul looks like it's just, no stimulation. Like how many people is that going to be appealing to? But that's only from the point of view of the pranic intelligence that you're trapped in.
The enemy, so to speak, is never going to paint the other side as being, the place to be at. There's nothing boring about the soul. There's nothing purposelessness about the soul. It's very, very beautiful. And who needs stimulation when you have purpose? And who needs stimulation when you have joy, true joy, which is the abundance of being at one with space. It's very, very beautiful. And space being the very alive communication of the universe, or some people might call it God, but it can also be called just the universe, or an atmic quality of communication. But let me come back to something that is also very important too, with regard to your description just then, and that is that when you don't know something in the pranic consciousness, you go into what you would consider is a process of rumination. So you go into your thinking and
working it out,
and
analysis.
Exactly, and you're bouncing around, so to speak, inside your head, which of course it's not even happening there, but you think it is. And then you suddenly come up with something that you didn't have when you started because you didn't know. So how can you tell someone that they didn't think when they started with something not knowing or not having an immediate answer? Then they ruminated to the buggery and they came up with it. And it may be just one of those aha moments where you just get illuminated. And that person is going to be convinced beyond doubt that they sourced something, that they sourced it, that they actually found it within themselves.
They worked it out.
So you get convinced that you're thinking. And school teaches us to put ourselves into that process where it's almost like you have to ruminate something. But the truth is, all you're doing is trying to recall. You're not actually thinking, you recall when it comes to school. And when it comes to just general everyday stuff that we consider we're thinking, it's a setup, because you're removed from knowing something by the source that's feeding you. And then it suddenly plugs you back in and says, here it is. And in the meantime, you're the one going, oh, I worked that out. But it's it withdrawing something, then giving it to you. It's such a setup. It's so simple.
Because we're actually plugged into a superintelligence.
Superintelligence. The human life, just say the pranic consciousness, forget the soul for a moment. Just the pranic consciousness is beyond superhuman. And millions of years ago, they already knew how to do flying cars. We're not going anywhere. It's always been there. So that is the ultimate tease, because it's just sprinkling whatever it wants by way of crumbs to the human apparatus, what it wants it to know and what it doesn't want it to know. And it's a complete setup, because it is the creator of the human apparatus. So it's this constant game of concealment of who is really running the show. Now, someone out there watching this interview is going to go, oh, hocus pocus, alien conspiracy, whatever. Just show me a model that works and I'll shut up. Just show me a model that is consistent. Don't color me the model. Show me a model. I'll zip my own lips when there's no slavery, when there's no poverty, when there's no bullying, when there's no defamation or vilification, when there is no belligerence, when domestic violence, ceases, but not only domestic violence, when there is true love in every relationship, when kids are raised to be who they truly are, when they're not crushed, when we eradicate all of that, sure, I have to go away. Otherwise, you have to get rid of me because I'm not going to stop.
On the subject of aliens, because let's knock that out of the water, because that conspiracy theory is part of the intelligence that doesn't want us to know, isn't it? Like, there's no greys from out of space that this isn't a conspiracy theory like that. Nearly every religion around the world will talk about the spiritual aspect of ourselves. It is much closer to home. We're outing that spiritual self that is wayward. It's right here, right now. It doesn't have flying saucers. It would like you to think it has flying saucers and is from out of space, so that it doesn't get exposed as being the wayward character that is currently running the show on Earth. And that's the real threat you pose in talking about this, isn't it?
We are the greys, and that's where we will eventually understand that. The giants that walk the planet that our ancestors have told us about, we are the greys, and we are the greys embodied. Although it's not a full embodiment, because it's a portion of that consciousness that actually gets embodied into the human being. And its greater portion is elsewhere. So we have elsewhere conscious presence that is running the show. That's why there's such a denigration to the human apparatus we call the human being. Because the greater proportion of that intelligence is enjoying itself in a body that doesn't have pain or emotions or distress. So it's almost like it's the ultimate puppeteer and puppet, because you have the situation where you can throw a doll against the wall. The doll will be mangulated and probably come apart and dismembered or whatever, and you can put it back together. But the desire is in the person who can throw it and get away with it. I know that's oversimplified.
This is big. No, it's great. It's great because it has to be simplified in order for it to be heard. The player that is the spirit that doesn't care zilch about the human body, we are its plaything. And the arrogance of that being will feed to you that no, you're an individual and you have choice and you're a sovereign being. That's the arrogance that we hang on to think this is all not just shadows on the wall. But what you're saying is that it's time that we actually expose the real player, because right now we're the rag doll.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go there, I can say, you get thrown against the wall and then you're made to believe that you threw yourself against the wall.
Whoa,
when in fact
self-loathing.
There's a force, correct, there's a force that is throwing you against the wall. We are, as if being human was true, if being human was the thinking source of being human, then we would not be repeating that which makes our own being suffer. It does not make sense. And we can call it whatever psychological terminology we want to throw at it. The fact is, yes, when there's a long-term misuse of energy, there will be chemical imbalances in the body. But what came first? What came first is the wrong fuel. It's the wrong intelligence. And that which keeps a behavior that is in denigration or in any form of impairment is the wrong fuel. That's what's there, not the human being. The human being is not the problem. It's its operator. And that is the ungod or the spirit.
Okay, so let's look at this. We've got the spirit, the ungod, playing with this human body. But this is an almost impossible situation to get out of if we've just got the wayward spirit and it's just puppeteering this human life and causing denigration to the human being. Where does divinity come in? Where does the soul come in, and how do we change that source of fuel from being fueled by that wayward being to being fueled by the soul, which is actually part of the whole, the continuum that cares for everyone, that is that equalizer? What's the relationship there of how we get out of that spiritual waywardness?
It comes from two actions need to occur, and we call it points of realization. And they actually happen within the pranic consciousness. They actually happen within the ungod itself, within the spirit. And that is a point of absolute honesty. And then absolute honesty nominating that which doesn't make sense anymore to you. And it's at that point that you then cross over to a very powerful occurrence, and it's called the renunciation. And it's the renunciation of desire for anything outside of you, anything that is not of the true you, anything that doesn't correlate with that moment of common sense that you have come to. When you have reached that, and that happens within the spirit, within the ungod, then you use will and you're in the alignment to the soul. And that's when the whole show changes. And being human at that moment is a completely different way of understanding yourself in a vehicle of expression for something you are told up front is outside of you. So there's nothing concealed when it comes to the soul. The soul says, I'm not in you, I'm not with you. You are my representation, but you will be held equally, because there's no such thing as disproportion in the universe. So you will be given everything that I am while you are alive and active and consider yourself alive in an apparatus we call being human, or the human being. Whereas the other side is the complete opposite to that, because the greater proportion of its consciousness, the greater proportion of its control and its intelligence is completely concealed, given over to a few crumbs, are told they are the source of the intelligence. It is the greatest form of deceit ever. And we have fallen, hook, line and sinker, as they say.
It's the character behind the curtain. So with the soul, you talk about that it's not in you, it's not with you, is how you described it, but it is holding of you. And are you talking about the fact that the soul says it is on another plane and can impulse you and hold you in human life, but it's not like, I don't say to you, oh, hi soul, I say, hi Serge, like you've got a vehicle, but it's being impulsed by soul, and therefore your movements are representative of that. Can you talk a bit about this elsewhere conscious presence of the soul being on another plane, which quantum mechanics has talked about the fact that it's very likely that consciousness is multidimensional, that it exists in different places. Can you speak to that and how
Sure.
that works?
I've been talking about multidimensional intelligence, whole body mindedness, multidimensional consciousness, and the fact that we hold presence elsewhere for a long time now, in fact 20 years. So we have to understand the difference between the pranic consciousness and the soul consciousness, or fiery consciousness as it's also called, is the level of transparency. So the soul says, I'm with you, I am your mind, but I'm not with you. In other words, you are an impulse or an overshadowing of my intelligence, and we will be at one, but I am not down there. I'm not on that realm. I'm not the physical apparatus. But once we become at one, because the vehicle of expression, the human body, can only be a vehicle of expression, then it's like being what we call soul embodiment. But there's no such thing as true soul embodiment, because the soul will always hold conscious presence in its own realm. Now, this isn't hocus pocus flying saucer stuff, or flying cups, or flying whatever. It's got nothing to do with flight. It's got everything to do with divine particles and the co-share of multi-conscious presence. It's a science, and it can be easily understood. And when it's applied, it makes perfect sense to what is happening in the world. Now, the problem is that when you propose something like this, if you're unlearned, well, one, if you're unlearned, you're going to be defamed because you shouldn't know what you know. But if you've got a PhD, then they isolate you and say, well, your PhD is only limited to that. So therefore, don't go outside that boundary, etc., etc. And if you try to do a PhD on this, it'll be stopped because there's too much pride in trying to protect everything else that is protecting itself from being concealed as being unconcealed as in terms of what's going on. So that's the impairment inside, in front of us. But let's go back to the question that you asked. We have a magnificence that we can tap into at any time. But the human being in the pranic consciousness is also tapping into elsewhere conscious presence. So the human apparatus, being human, will never hold exclusive conscious presence. We can't. It's impossible. Nowhere in the universe is there a realm that is exclusive to any other. And I've been teaching since 1999 that we are a dual realm at least, and that's astral and physical. One is just denser than the other. Both are, everything is energy. So everything is energy. Everything is because of energy. So those two realms are one and the same. And one day we will go back to seeing that fact. It may not happen in my lifetime, but we will. We will. But that's not the end, because there's other realms we access consciousness from. And the word is access. There's no teleportation, and I think in the Matrix they go into it or something. I haven't seen the movies, unfortunately, so only from what I'm told. There is no transporting yourself elsewhere. It's happening all at the same time. And so what we're trying to do is achieve what we can in the human form, as much presence as possible from the correct realm, from the correct intelligence. And once we do that, we're going to be fine. Because at the moment, we're already doing that. We're just not told that we're doing that. That's the deviousness, that's the deceit of this current model that allows you to think that you think, or it educates you that you think, when actually you're not thinking. All you're doing is accessing what is already there to be accessed. We're never going to access more, and we don't need to access less. If you want to be, I don't want to stereotypicalize the example, but if you want to be a bum in the street, that requires an intelligence. You can access that. It's very simple. You're not deranged. You're accessing that form of knowing how to exist. For example, I don't know how to exist on the streets. I mean, I guess if I had to, I would, but it's not in me to access that. To me, it's too disturbing to do that. But for another person, for them, they seem to be able to manage it very, very well. So to me, I don't see it as a lesser human being. I see it as another form of intelligence being used in the manner that that person has aligned themselves to access, to be used, and express that by way of reflection on this plane of life.
And the intelligence gets exposed all the time because you've got also like a child that is a prodigy and might know things that they can't possibly be knowing from recall. It's like they're accessing some kind of super intelligence like that. But this particular person may not grow up to be particularly loving, but they're super intelligent. So that to me is proof of what you're talking about, that we source, that the intelligence is elsewhere that is being sourced, and it can kind of provide these moments of wowness, but in fact there's some kind of super puppet show going on in the background.
Yeah, and there's a throwaway line that adds to the deceit, and that is it's instinct. You know, oh yeah, it's instinct, but it's not instinct. You're accessing something, and if the way we are led to be educated, or we're schooled to understand that things have to be taught to us, but when you're a baby, you know what is untoward, and it registers. So you don't have to wait until you're old enough to learn to speak and comprehend definition with regard to abuse to know that you have been abused, be it psychological, physical, sexual, etc. So somewhere in you, you're registering something that is not true, that is untoward. And that comes from your divine particles, knowing what is true and what is not from an energetic point of view. Whether it happens physically or not, you can register that.
So this is the body's intelligence.
This is the body's intelligence, but that body's intelligence is accessing a universal form of presence at that time, because it can't be the source. Everything is a conglomerate of communication. So there isn't any one source. It's all happening all at the one time.
So through the fact of its divine particles, it's sourcing that intelligence.
Correct. So, for example, abuse doesn't exist where those divine particles access their intelligence from. So when you approach the human body, say a parent approaches, or a neighbor or someone approaches the baby with energy other than a holding of it as an equal and in absolute love, harmony, and pure harmlessness, then the particles say, yes, we're at one. The moment there is any untowardness, even resentment towards a child for, taking my time away from my wife or my husband or something like that, or jealousy between families over a baby that might be really gorgeous and alive and vivacious, any form of expression is registered in those divine particles. So that can be later understood because it plays itself out in behaviors if it hasn't been cleared. But what is registering that? Because the baby wasn't schooled into this is abuse and this is... Now, never let this happen because this is actually abuse. But how did you register that it was abuse before you even knew how that word existed, spelt, and what it meant? And yet you're registering abuse. Do you understand what I'm saying here?
It's huge because we are not a tabula rasa. We are not a blank slate when we are born. We are born with the intelligence of love as our default. And so if that's the case, somebody recently said to me, that they had a huge revelation through one of your workshops. And basically they had an aha moment when they realized that love is our default state. But we're brought up to believe, especially as we become an adult, that we have to keep choosing love and making self-loving choices and being loving to live a better life. But there's no doing in love. Love is the default. And so all of this distraction and the jealousy, the comparison, all of the waywardness that happens on top of human life, that's the thing that's unsustainable. That's the thing that has to constantly repeat itself that's the distraction that has to constantly be had in order for you to not feel the default state. But when you're in that distraction and you're in the self-loathing that it feeds you, you think that you're not even worthy of that, but that is you. That's the setup, isn't it?
That's correct. And let's give our audience a little bit of a popcorn moment and end this interview, and maybe we can pick it up. And that is simply this. Our divine particles are love, what we would call love. It's not love in the human sense. It's a love based on universality, where harm does not exist, abuse does not exist. Everything is the purity of oneness. And moving towards, by virtue of a movement that is unstoppable, towards unifying that and leaving not a single particle behind. That is what we're born as. It's not instinct. It is much greater than instinct. I mean, you can call it instinct if you're referring to what I'm talking about. I don't care what the word is. The fact is, we belong to a super great science that will never ever be corrupted. The corruption is the imposter. It's an overlay. So it's a layer on top of that which remains unsullied by the imposition. So let's just stop and just consider that love is much more than innate. It's actually universal. And there has to be a layer that overrides that. And we have to then give prominence to that layer to give us a presence in that imposition. Because if we remove ourselves from that imposition by way of will, our focus away from that presence, we are back into the only one presence, the continuity of love.
Beautiful.